Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. Joining me today is a return guest and a friend of this podcast, Ragan Schriver. Ragan is an associate professor of practice at the University of Tennessee College of Social Work, where he teaches clinical and leadership courses. He's also the director of the MSSW Program, Knoxville Campus, and the chair of the Forensic Social Work Certificate Program. In addition to his work in academia, Ragan also serves as the special assistant to the president of the Catholic Charities USA, where he assists with developing integrated health programs within the network. We're excited to have Ragan with us today to discuss the construct of boundaries. Ragan, I got to say in the introduction that you are both a return guest and a friend of this podcast. It's so nice to have you back. Welcome.
Thank you. It's always good to be with you all. I love the conversations we have and getting a chance to share our ideas.
I really do as well. Hey, I know that you recently taught a course on boundaries, around this subject of boundaries, and I want to kind of open it up to you to talk about this construct of boundaries. It's such an important area of our lives, oftentimes misunderstood. But I would love to kind of just turn it over to you right now. Give us a little bit of background around this course, your decision to teach it, some of the things you might learn. Take it away, please.
Well, it was elicited from a local agency here in my area here in Knoxville, Tennessee, that they serve primarily persons who are unhoused. And they reached out to me because across the board, it was from executive to janitor to case manager to therapist. They were all having a tough time, like leaving it behind, so caring for the self. Also, what's good for the client, like what is the expectation that I'm giving to the client if I'm available 24 hours, those types of things. And then like just the whole therapeutic relationship, if it's a more clinical setting, what is this process? What is this relationship that we're in a therapeutic way? And how does the boundary get aligned with that? So, I mean, those were kind of three big things to think about. And I felt like all three of them almost really did meet everything from executive to therapist to case manager to janitor to whatever. So it was just an amazing thing to see and hear and have a conversation about. Because if you're at a social agency or a clinical setting, and there are people that do maybe the administrative type of work, make the appointments and things like that, there is a boundary that needs to be set up there, but I don't know if anybody's talking to people about those ideas. And then even like from a therapist standpoint, I know like I teach in our master's program here at University of Tennessee, and we have a day on ethics and tie in boundaries of relationships there. And then the next thing we're moving on to what's next. And so sometimes I think that we give a nod to it, and then students hear what they hear, and then they kind of grab onto that. And so that's my thinking about just this whole idea of boundaries. When I think about boundaries and what we teach our students and maybe what we end up carrying into practice for a long time is there's almost like there's two extremes and then a perfect middle. Like that it really is a Goldilocks, that either I'm overly engaged and overly involved and enmeshed or entangled with the client or the person I'm serving, versus I'm so distant and unplugged. And then there's the Goldilocks where I'm just right. But really, it's so much broader than that. Like, it's just such a broad perspective of what is the boundary. And I think it's also, we want to say, I think sometimes that there's this there is that Goldilocks, but then it might be a Goldilocks for each individual client, that it might be an individual, just right for each client that I think about.
What a great start. You're talking about some of the pillars around this construct of boundaries and the essential nature of boundaries in healthy relationships. I had a friend who once said, the healthiest neighbors have the best fences. And it's not keeping people out. It's not keeping people locked in. It's allowing for things to function well and to their potential when those things are in place. And you're beginning to, at the start here, you're saying several things. One is part of it as a clinician, as the person, in engaging, there's a self-care need to be factored in. Secondly, it's about setting some clear expectations about what things are, what things aren't. And this idea of kind of a healthy middle, the Goldilocks middle, I love that, rather than kind of a pendulum swing, all in, all out. It's not that. Talk a little bit more about some of the things that you began to lay out around boundaries as you were teaching folks in this teaching opportunity you had?
I feel like that if we think about it, just like if we talked about the therapeutic bucket for a second, that I
Sure.
think that when we look at our, like maybe many of us might have been in our older year or younger years, if we're a little bit older, that might have been grounded in more of a psychodynamic or more of a Freudian type of an approach where the therapist is a blank slate. And then the transference process becomes so important that like I as the client lay onto you whatever issue or relational issue that I may have. And so I think that when I think about the kind of the history of what is an important boundary with a client, that am I just so this blank slate? But I feel like we've moved from that. Whether you're still grounded in a psychodynamic approach, I think that transference is of course a real thing. But I don't think we have to be a blank slate. We can be a real person because it is a real relationship. I always just tell the students, hey, look, this is a real, and even in my own practice, I feel like that the corrective factor is the relationship that I'm here with you. I'm attuning to you. I'm attached to you in this
Yes.
unique way. And how do we do this? But you know, where I'm using myself. The use of self is a real deal in
Yeah.
this process. But how do I protect myself from maybe? And then how do I engage with my real feelings in this? And I feel like some of this discussion of boundaries is so entangled in that conversation on how do I be in a real relationship where I'm using my real emotions and my real ideas and real intellect to be with this person to help them achieve their goals therapeutically.
That's such a good reminder that interpersonal relationships both are the cause of harm and the potential for corrective emotional experiences to occur such that healing can occur.
Mhm.
But in that healing role, let's say as professionals, there's a need, isn't there, to be clear about what that role is, what that role is not. Therapy is not about the therapist. It's about an opportunity to show up as a therapist for the patient,
Mhm.
to show up for the patient in such a way that we are what they need us to be, not a blank slate, but engaged, open, present, but keeping the focus on them, but being real in the process. And that's oftentimes a really artful role, isn't it? To establish. Say more about that piece.
I think the word that you just gave is the real. How do I be real? How do I be authentically me,
Yeah. Yeah.
but not feel urged to share my own issues or put what I need onto the client? You know that if you look at the two extremes and then the middle, like it's always exhibited by the entangled boundaries exhibited by kind of dots, and then the rigid boundary is set by a straight line, and then the dashes are sort of the Goldilocks. You're like right there where it's
Right.
supposed to be. So how do I let a bit of myself go in and out as appropriate and that would be helpful with the person? You know, I feel like that to me is the challenge. Like how if I'm going to tell us something about myself that I feel like might connect or might be helpful to the client, I think it's important for me to kind of think through what am I going to what is the purpose? Why am I telling this? Is this because I feel it's on my mind? I think it's funny, or is it because it's on my mind? I need to share this with somebody, or is it hey this person needs to know that they're not the only one that has experienced whatever
That's right.
this issue
So,
is.
yeah, so you want to kind of validate, you want to kind of normalize, you want to make it feel like this is universal. It's not just you. And so those are all healing components in this process. And you're saying also to be very intentional in the things that we say or don't say so that it stays in the client's best interest always. As you were teaching this course, what were you sharing with the attendees about some of the key principles around boundary setting in one's work?
This is talk about being a nerd. So this is what I kind of like talked about that. Like we know that that the brain produces the oxytocin,
Yeah.
which is a chemical in our body that like when a mother's giving birth to the baby and even the dad, there's a higher presence of oxytocin in the bloodstream than if it was not you're not giving birth or having a new baby. So it helps this relationship to connect.
Yeah.
And then we find that happens. It's like the kind of call it like the friendship or a love chemical where you feel attached to someone and there's a little bit of an increase in the oxytocin and there's a bit of an attachment and it happens in friendships and love, things like that. And so I think sometimes if you're in a real relationship, sometimes I think that oxytocin can get jolted a bit. So no wonder we might find ourselves maybe more connected to one client or another, or maybe finding ourselves more like wanting to be more available to another client than another. It's just sort of like a natural bodily response or in a brain response in a way. But so I think sometimes we feel bad about like, wow, I really think about this client before I go to bed at night, or I'm really thinking about this client a lot. But this other client, I'm not having it. I don't feel it. I don't have it. So do I feel bad about myself about having these two different levels of clients? And I think it's only a kind of a, if we could kind of forgive ourselves for that and realize that we're just trying to respond,
Right.
if that makes
Right.
sense.
It makes great sense. In fact, what you're talking about here is kind of this countertransferential component of the relationship. So transference is when the patient brings something to us, they're transferring onto us is kind of that blank slate, but we're not blank slate, but that just kind of a safe other. They're going to bring up and transfer onto us, and they're going to work things out kind of in relationship with us. But the countertransferential part is my response to the person that I'm sitting in front of. And we oftentimes used to think that countertransference was a bad thing. If you had transference coming up our thoughts, well, you got to go into your therapy and work that out. No, not at all. In fact, it can be so informative. And there's several parts to it, as we know. One is my stuff, and we all have our own stuff. And the other part of it is kind of what we call kind of a complementary countertransference, where there's something in the enactment happening in the therapy session where I'm being pulled or drawn into an enactment in the patient's life, and I get to be curious about what that is. And the other part is kind of a concordant where we have the empathic response, which is what we want to have. So if I'm finding this tendency to just, rescue this patient and, to really kind of go in and do things for them, but I know it's not the right thing. I'm wondering what that's about. Chances are that's a complementary role. People in their lives have always gone in and rescued them, or that's what that's what they pull on others. And my task is to deny that role, not in a mean way, but to talk about what the need is and go to that concordant place where I empathically name what that is and have them work maybe towards more self-reliance and independence. Or if I have the sense of, man, I'm really, this is a really hard case for me because here's somebody who's really kind of histrionic and hysterical, and I just not looking forward to this next hour. Maybe that's my stuff. Maybe in my family of origin, I had somebody who was histrionic and hysterical and they couldn't show up, and it was really hard to get them to sit down and focus. And that's my own stuff, isn't it? So I love what you're raising right here, that there's a way to watch for and be curious about our reactions that come up in a therapy session. And that kind of transferential piece is a nice thing to kind of remind us of.
I think you're kind of also making me think about like my own internal boundaries. If I walled off something inside of myself that
Yes.
maybe I need to doesn't need to be behind that wall or something.
So let's talk about that. I mean, maybe there's somebody's talking about, the death of a loved one recently. And what if I just lost somebody? I might not want to go into any depth of that because they're triggering me and that's my stuff again. And I might say, well, we kind of been there, done that, or I might not go as deep as I might need to go for their sake. So you're exactly right.
I have a dear friend that he's a therapist and he's a long time, way longer, more astute than I'll ever be. And he was talking about this one client that he would see in the afternoon once a week, and he just found himself falling asleep during the session.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, it must be the time of day, so I'll move it to the morning. Bingo again, 10 a.m. in the morning, same thing, having the same reaction. And he realized in conversation with his own supervisor, which was another testament to him that he kept a supervisor after all of the years of practice. And he discovered this guy was pushing a button that he hadn't opened in himself. So he did his own work and was able to be then authentic with the client after that and stay awake.
Isn't that great? Yeah, I think that's really a good thing. Or maybe sometimes too, maybe the client's kind of staying in an area for a long, long period of time. And maybe in some ways, it's kind of hard to say, but it's true because then if we can name it as such, we can work through it. Maybe there's some boring stuff coming up because we keep going over and over and over the same thing. And we think, well, there's a place for empathic listening and kind of sitting with it. And yet sometimes there's a point of saying, hey, I've noticed that we've sat with this for weeks and weeks and weeks and nothing's changing. What's going on? And I find, and maybe, depending on the strength of the relationship, I find myself kind of having a hard time sitting with, what's it like for you to keep going over and over it as well? And then we get to bring it back into the relationship, not in a judgment way, but in a way that says, can we get curious about this?
I love it's kind of talking about patterns. What's the pattern in the client's life? Because I know like we've all had, I guess, difficult clients that have like maybe want to demand more, like more of our time or want to call on the phone or want to, kind of bust through the boundary a bit because it's just not anything that they ever learned or didn't ever have in their life. And so how is that pattern playing out in the relationship with me? And wow, might be playing out in the relationships in their other life, that no wonder people don't want to be, maybe be engaging with you, because this demand that you're placing, and I'm experiencing it myself. Let's be curious about, I love to be curious about that pattern in your life.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Americans are increasingly concerned about mental health, with nearly 9 in 10 voters seeing it as a crisis. Mental Health First Aid provides crucial training to identify, understand, and respond to mental health and substance use challenges. Gain the skills and confidence to offer life-saving assistance. We offer courses for individuals, groups, and organizations of all sizes, including specialized training for veterans, law enforcement, EMS, and educators. Visit mentalhealthfirstaid.org or email hello@mentalhealthfirstaid.org to schedule your training and make a difference in your community.
As you're working, with the course you just taught and you walk things through, and, as you're working with your students, at the university, what are you saying to them, and how are you teaching them to set these boundary moments in really necessary ways? Because once the boundary's in place, we can be all kinds of free inside that, almost like a corral. Once we put that fence up, and we really boundary this in good ways. Boundaries don't limit. Boundaries create healthy boundaries. They create safety. They create opportunity. They create security, and they allow for curiosity and growth. Without them, we feel afraid. And most people who come to see us usually have ruptured boundaries in some ways, or those are going to go work with those in need. Those in need oftentimes haven't really had good boundaries in their lives, and they're not very good boundary setters. So we're in the role of setting a boundary. Talk about some of the ways you help your students, maybe the ones you talked to class to recently, in setting those boundaries. How are you telling them to do it?
We've had some very cool conversations. I think cool conversations with the agency that I was with, and then also just with our students, because I feel like it's really cool to hear, like, what's your experience of a boundary? Where did you grow up? What was the message that you had? Oftentimes I hear from people like, well, I'm supposed to be all things for all people. I'm supposed to be available. Aren't I supposed to be a service-minded person? I'm supposed to give of myself.
Yeah, boundaries. What are you talking about, boundaries? There's no boundaries.
Yeah. I can't be selfish.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing is, I love what you said. There's such freedom that I know that this is the arena in which I am, and here's the boundary around it, and that I have such freedom within this. And I know that I don't have to be questioning, should I be over here or should I be over there? I'm here, and I'm going to be free to be in this arena, whatever that is. I love that finding freedom within the concept of boundary.
Well, you're talking about something here too. I think it's a good point. Is what are some of the misconceptions about a boundary? And maybe it's like, well, if I have a boundary, I can't be empathic, right? If I have a boundary, I can't be available, right? Speak more about maybe some of the common misconceptions that you might hear. Also, maybe even weave in what might be some maybe familial factors, or maybe even some cultural factors that make setting boundaries hard. So the misconceptions, family factors, cultural factors that might make putting boundaries in place a challenge.
Several things kind of come to mind. I think that, like, this idea of, we've probably heard it all before, like, I'm a rescuer. So I feel like maybe if the family dynamic in my setup was like, I'm my mother's confidant, and then that's how I learned to be such a good listener against another parent or something like that. And then I'm in this triangle. I've become really good at being in that. So then I take that into that sort of boundary that I have into the therapeutic relationship. Then I become this, like, the third party out there is the evil guy, and I'm the hero because I'm listening to you. So that, how do I think about it for myself? How do I limit that? And how do I take that boundary that was sort of violated by maybe somebody in my family? And then how am I aware of that? I think that's just a gigantic thing. And then the second thing that I think about is that I feel sometimes our students, and I think I've seen this in practice too, that sometimes our students hear that no dual relationship, no multiple relationship, so then go out and somebody happens to see something, you change your name on Facebook or something, and then, I have to terminate the relationship with a client because they saw me on Facebook. And so how do we manage that in an appropriate way? Yeah, I exist. I'm in the world. I have a Facebook page. And I know that you may have seen that. How did you feel about that? And it could be a therapeutic moment rather than I need to cut you off moment.
Yeah, it makes good sense. So you're raising a couple of pieces. One is, and I love the start around this. It's let's appreciate the role of boundaries or the absence thereof in our own families of origin. If I had an enmeshed relationship with the members of my family, I had no boundaries. And as children, it's not the children's job to put the boundaries in place. It's the parents' job to put the boundaries in place. So there's healthy exchange. There's got to be fences in healthy relationships, even in families. And if there's not, we never learn I don't even know how to spell boundaries. And I think that if I put a boundary in place, a relationship is not going to exist. And I'm not going to be that caring person that I've somehow been conditioned or indoctrinated to believe that I am when I am boundaryless. Or maybe I have such heinous interactions early on or painful interactions. Maybe my boundaries are so rigid, I keep people out. And while I stay safe, I basically preempt or foreclose on rather healthy relationships happening. I don't let those things in, all because of my family of origin. And I'm probably not even aware of it. So I love starting with what's the role of boundaries in your family of origin? Then the second piece is, what are your professional expectations? And, dual relationships are, again, in our code of ethics to protect the patients from having to be in an uncomfortable role, having two things going on at one time. Our task is to be one role with them and to make it about, what their needs are and helping them through those areas of life that they come to see us for. So yeah, I think those are really good. And, it's also a small world. I live in Hawaii and we live in a small island, and I'm going to bump into somebody in Costco or at a coffee shop, and people always feel a little, well, how am I supposed to react? And I'm always hello. And I usually let them acknowledge me first and come up if they want to. But it's their choice. And what I love is that you can bring these things back into the therapy relationship. Say, hey, what was it like to see me in Costco the other day if they have an issue? Or I like that.
I think you're right. I think like if people can practice, here we're in the
Right.
session, I saw you at the store. How did you feel about that? And it almost can be a chance for the client to think, oh, wait a minute, I had a choice, or I can not speak, or I do have autonomy over my own boundary, and to learn. It can be a real learning kind of, in quotes, a lab in in the therapeutic relationship. It could be like a lab on how do I set appropriate boundary.
Yes. I'm going to shift it a little bit to maybe the patient client's role around boundaries. And, part of therapy is making the unconscious conscious, right? We basically, what I'm doing, why am I doing, what's the motivation, drive behind it, what's the underlying need? And what if I come to you and I say, you don't seem to want to help me. You don't seem to want to kind of go the extra mile. I just asked if you give me, can you give me some research on this or point me in some right directions? Or basically I'm asking you to do things that I could do. But I'm seeing you not as being, you don't seem as, caring as I'd like you to be. And and it's not about your heart not being caring. And it's not about your desire to be helpful. This is more that complimentary, that's more this enactment. You're putting up a healthy boundary for my sake, but I don't like it because it pulls something out of me. How would you encourage folks to kind of help the other person kind of look at that boundary and what that means to them?
It's interesting you asked this because, okay, this is maybe a little quick story in relationship to what you're saying. I kind of have kept the clock, like, so that I get behind the client, so that I'm not going like this. So I'm not holding my arm up and looking at my watch to see,
Yes.
oh yeah, being mindful of time. So I can just kind of glance over. Okay, so because I feel like the termination of each session is just as important as the everything else, because of the boundary.
Absolutely.
Like, here's the time ending, and how do I appropriately wrap this up and all that kind of stuff. I think that's an important element. So I keep that clock there. Well, a client saw that clock and took such offense to it that, like,
Yeah.
you want to watch for when am I going to be over? What other clocks do you have hidden in here, and that kind of thing. And so at first it freaked me out, like, oh, I'm caught, or something like that. But then I realized, wait a minute, okay, it's okay for me to set a boundary. It's okay for me to be able to do this. I can have a clock and know what time it is. That's all legit. Because and then to be able to say, let's talk about this. What does that clock represent to you? Are you knowing that you have a certain amount of time with me? How does that feel to you? And let it come from the client. So hopefully they can use it as a learning, like, oh, wait,
Yeah.
people have boundaries.
Exactly. People have boundaries and it means something to them. Out of curiosity, how did that story end when you invited him to say, hey, what does that mean to you? Great question.
He did talk about that I'm a prioritization wound. That I've heard it put that way, that he was never a priority through his life. And so he saw me as prioritizing the clock and my time and who was going to come after him, rather than me prioritizing him. And we were able to talk about like how you are my priority during this time and this process is your priority during this time, kind of thing.
Wow, what a great response. So this guy probably didn't, people in his life didn't have healthy boundaries such that they didn't show up for him in a prioritizing way.
Mhm.
So he saw that when someone else had a clock or a limit, he saw that as, you're not going to prioritize me either, are you? So if we don't take those moments to bring that content back into the relationship, man, we miss out on some really rich material. And it's going to be things around, when are we going to start? When are we going to stop? We're going to start on time. We're going to end on time. My availability outside the office is this. I'm not available in these ways. Here's what you do when. And again, on the one hand, that's really a therapeutic place, because then we can be all kinds of free inside that. But it's also going to kick up things like with this guy of, well, it doesn't sound like you're going to be really that engaged or that concerned, or you're going to, maybe you don't prioritize. Maybe it's a prioritization wound. When you allow for it to come back in the relationship, good things get to be unveiled, don't they?
It does, and I think it took a minute for me to kind of like, because I wanted to defend myself, and I think that's sort of a natural thing. But I really do think that it became a part of a cool process. I
Yeah.
think this exploration.
As you continue to teach on this, what might you find yourself emphasizing more and more, both to your students or community, programs you consult with, or I know you work with the church and, consult with them as well. As you see yourself kind of staying in this realm, and it's again, the basics of relationships being established. What do you see yourself maybe in upcoming talks really wanting to focus on and really convey to folks and help them develop around this construct of boundaries?
Gosh, lots of things. I feel that what I'm hearing from the population of students is a little bit more of a rigid, kind of thing. But then what I'm hearing from more practice oriented is a little bit less rigid. That I'm trying to be more available than I maybe learned or than it could. It's funny to see, like, in an ideal setting, I'm going to be real rigid. If a dual relationship is no way, even if I see you at church on Sunday, I'm going to chop off. We're at the same church. We can't be together in this setting. Versus when you're in the field and in it so long, sometimes it can maybe wear down a little bit. How do we stay fresh? How do we stay healthy so that we're not letting the boundary wear down over time? To me, I think that's just a really, really important thing to reflect on. It's interesting to see that sort of shift from the more rigid or to the more kind of less in practice.
You're naming something right there on the theme of self-care again, and that's where you started us today. And we think, well, if I give and give and give, that means I really love, I really care. That's the role I'm supposed to take. But if I'm burned out and you're coming to me to really do some heavy work and I'm burned out because I don't have any boundaries, I'm not doing you any favors. And at some point on the therapist side, if they're giving, 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 and they're getting drained, burned out, et cetera, it's not unnatural to start to build a resentment to the needs being presented. And it's not about the patient's need, it's about your management of those needs. And so we kind of flip it unintentionally sometimes. Man, the person's too demanding, everything else. They're not too demanding, you're too available. Their needs are there. It's how you manage them. And oftentimes, again, those that come to see us have not had the best experience with boundaries. So part of having boundaries in place teaches them that boundaries are okay in their lives, that they get to do what we're doing with them. So I love that idea of self-care too. That's an important piece, Ragan.
You mentioned also like the work with the church. I do feel like folks, and I don't know how many, but like that if you're in ministry, in some sort of ministry, oftentimes people know where you live and then maybe expect a different level from you if you're in some sort of pastoral role. It's just as important there as it
Oh,
is
yeah.
in a more explicitly therapeutic setting.
I think pastors have one of the highest burnout rates because they believe that there's such a mandate to be available in all ways, for all things, for all people. And like therapists, they have to set the same kinds of boundaries. And, it's hard to say no. It's hard to say, I can't see you today, but unless there's an emergency, we, manage something, but I'll see you at our next time together. Or maybe we can meet this weekend. And having to say no is always a little bit of a conflict, but then when we get comfortable with it, we get to realize that's probably the best way to manage it, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I really do believe that as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. So as you go forward with I know you teach again in the school, and you're kind of a person that's desired to come around and teach things. What do you want the benefit of healthy boundaries having in people's lives? What do you see professionals that are being trained under your teaching in your school, those that are working in the community to go out and really be successful? What are you hoping that they incorporate around boundaries that's going to make them really good at what they're doing?
I hope that it can be a therapeutic tool in a way. From the things that
Yes.
we've been talking about have been an opportunity for just someone to grow or learn or live into a new way of being and a new way of relating, and to discover that in yourself and say, I don't have to be available to every single person every minute. And I can say no to people. I don't have to just be the yes. I don't have to be a doormat. I can uh, stand up for myself, and that you have a safe place to practice that within this therapeutic boundary that we have here together.
I like that theme of we as professionals are constantly growing too. And we're growing in our schooling. We're recognizing things about ourselves, like you brought us back to today. Let's start with your family of origin. What do these things mean to you? And the idea of always kind of maintaining a little bit of keeping that edge honed about how am I doing in my boundaries? My sending texts and my sending voicemails. What do I say in those things? How do I conduct myself in a session? Where am I sitting? What am I disclosing? What am I avoiding addressing and that they might need to address? All of these things are really cool things that you're reminding us that we can be aware of, can't we?
And it's something that isn't. I feel like it is kind of a kind of razor thing. My authenticity versus my boundary that I set, and who am I? Who am I showing up therapeutically? How am I being authentic in that? I think it takes work, self reflection, and supervision, and
Speak about that part. I think this does take a lot of work, but it's what we signed up for.
yeah.
And if we want to show up, this is the best way for us to show up in really healthy, boundaried ways. And one thing you just mentioned right there is the benefit of having consultation, mentorship, those kinds of things. Talk about the importance, or even just a peer, consultation. Says, hey, can I run something by you? Speak to the importance of that.
I think that's just I just feel like it's number one. I mean I went to school a long time ago, and I'm sure what I learned then was great for the time, but maybe now I need to be thinking about something, a new way to think of it, or a new way to reflect on it, and to have somebody that I can bounce that off on, especially as I mature and as I grow too. I want my practice and my relationship with my clients to grow and to develop, and I don't think I can just do it by sitting and thinking about it by myself. Although that's an important thing to meditate and be mindful, but, like, I think it's always great to have another eye on it and just to kinda give another perspective.
When you put it like that, I think if we can encourage our colleagues, our upcoming, colleagues, our young people to be able to say, hey, ideally, you are in a role where you can consult with somebody. You have a colleague you can go to. You have a mentor you can get some consultation with. Because if you can bring these things to a conversation level, you're less likely to keep them at an acting out level and put yourself at risk and the patient at risk.
Mhm.
And I think in those consultations, we get to talk about, hey, you know what? I'm really drawn to this person. I find myself thinking about them. I think they're attractive. I find myself being drawn to them. Flip side of that might be, I cannot wait till that hour is over. And that's hard to hear therapists say that, but we're human too. But more times than not, those things have a reason.
Mhm.
And if some stuff I haven't worked out in my life, I get to go work that out because it's not about the patient, it's about me. Or if I don't want to see that person, maybe there's something in the interaction that's really maybe they're challenging. Maybe they're prickly and pokey. Maybe the content is hard for me because I just had a loss and I don't want to deal with whatever it is. If we can talk about these things, then we can show up in the way that we're expected to, and we're less likely, aren't we, to act something out that can be harmful.
Absolutely, absolutely. It can be preventative, it can be healing for us, it can be help us be more authentic in our own life experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Preventative and also healing are the options in that. Well, Reagan, I know we're kind of coming around the bend here, and I always love our times. I love your mind, I love your heart, and I love your enthusiasm to these things. And I bet these folks that you recently spoke with just learned a bunch from their time with you. I would love to have folks after our show today to follow up with you, to learn more about you and the work you do. How can they connect with you after our time today?
Well, through the College of Social Work at the University of Tennessee, we've got a great program here. We have information sessions about our program, and we have opportunities for people to take some postgraduate courses. We have a trauma treatment certificate. We have an organizational leadership certificate. We have a school social work certificate that people can do post grad, like if you're on your own out practice, you can come back and maybe do some of these post-grad things too. So
Really nice.
It's a great. I love our profession. I love what we do.
Well, that's your enthusiasm is easy to pick up on and fun to join with. And as always, man, I really appreciate you being a friend to this program, and we really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for being with us, Ragan.
Thank you very much for having me. You guys are awesome.
I also want to thank you, our listeners, for dropping by and joining Ragan and me today. It's always great to have you with us. Regarding this episode, I want to remind you that it and its resources and all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/PhD. Thanks again for being with us on the show, and we'll look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.